The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order by Samuel Phillips Huntington. Chapter 6: The Cultural Reconfiguration of Global Politics. Why was Turkey passed over, and why does it always seem to be at the end of the queue? In public, European officials referred to Turkey's low level of economic development and its less than Scandinavian respect for human rights. In private, both the Europeans and Turks agreed that the real reasons were the intense opposition of the Greeks and, more importantly, the fact that Turkey is a Muslim country. European countries did not want to face the possibility of opening their borders to immigration from a country of 60 million Muslims and much unemployment. Even more significantly, they felt that culturally the Turks did not belong in Europe. Turkey's human rights record, as President Özal said in 1992, is a made up reason why Turkey should not join the European Council. The real reason is that we are Muslim and they are Christian. But he added, they don't say that. European officials in turn agreed that the Union is a Christian club and that Turkey is too poor, too populous, too Muslim, too harsh, too culturally different, too everything. The private nightmare of Europeans, one observer commented, is the historical memory of Saracen raiders in Western Europe and the Turks at the gates of Vienna. These attitudes in turn generated the common perception among Turks that the West sees no place for a Muslim Turkey within Europe. Having rejected Mecca and being rejected by Brussels, Turkey seized the opportunity opened by the dissolution of the Soviet Union to turn toward Tashkent. President Özal and other Turkish leaders held out the vision of a community of Turkic peoples and made great efforts to develop links with the external Turks in Turkey's near abroad, stretching from the Adriatic to the borders of China. Particular attention was directed to Azerbaijan and the four Turkic-speaking Central Asian republics of Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. In 1991 and 1992, Turkey launched a wide range of activities designed to bolster its ties with and its influence in these new republics. These included $1.5 billion in long term, low interest loans, $79 million in direct relief aid, satellite television, replacing a Russian language channel, telephone communications, airline service, thousands of scholarships for students to study in Turkey, and training in Turkey for Central Asian and Azeri bankers, business persons, diplomats, and hundreds of military officers. Teachers were sent to the new republics to teach Turkish, and about 2,000 joint ventures were started. Cultural commonality smoothed these economic relationships. As one Turkish businessman commented, the most important thing for success in Azerbaijan or Turkmenistan is finding the right partner. For Turkish people, it is not so difficult. We have the same culture, more or less the same language, and we eat from the same kitchen. Turkey's reorientation towards the Caucasus and Central Asia was fueled not only by the dream of being the leader of a Turkic community of nations, but also by the desire to counter Iran and Saudi Arabia from expanding their influence and promoting Islamic fundamentalism in the region. The Turks saw themselves as offering the Turkish model or the idea of Turkey, a secular, democratic Muslim state with the market economy as an alternative. In addition, Turkey hoped to contain the resurgence of Russian influence. By providing an alternative to Russia and Islam, Turkey would bolster its claim for support from and eventual membership in the European Union. Turkey's initial surge of activity with the Turkic republics became more restrained in 1993 due to the limits on its resources. The succession of Suleiman Demirel to the presidency following Özal's death and the reassertion of Russia's influence in what it considered its near abroad. When the Turkic former Soviet republics first became independent, their leaders rushed to Ankara to court Turkey. Subsequently, as Russia applied pressure and inducements, they swung back and generally stressed the need for balanced relationships between their cultural cousin and their former imperial master. The Turks, however, continued to attempt to use their cultural affiliations to expand their economic and political linkages, and in their most important coup, secured agreement of the relevant governments and oil companies to the construction of a pipeline to bring Central Asian and Azerbaijani oil through Turkey to the Mediterranean. While Turkey worked to develop its links with the Turkic former Soviet republics, its own Kemalist secular identity was under challenge at home. First, for Turkey, as for many other countries, the end of the Cold War, together with the dislocations generated by social and economic development, raised major issues of national identity and ethnic identification, and religion was there to provide an answer. The secular heritage of Ataturk and of the Turkish elite for two-thirds of a century came increasingly under fire. The experience of Turks abroad tended to stimulate Islamist sentiments at home. Turks coming back from West Germany reacted to hostility there by falling back on what was familiar, and that was Islam. Mainstream opinion and practice became increasingly Islamist. In 1993, it was reported that Islamic style beards and veiled women have proliferated in Turkey, that mosques are drawing even larger crowds, and that some bookstores are overflowing with books and journals, cassettes, compact discs, and videos glorifying Islamic history, precepts, and way of life, and exalting the Ottoman Empire's role in preserving the values of the Prophet Muhammad. Reportedly, no fewer than 290 publishing houses and printing presses, 300 publications, including 4 dailies, some 100 unlicensed radio stations, and about 30 likewise unlicensed television channels were all propagating Islamic ideology. Confronted by rising Islamist sentiment, Turkey's rulers attempted to adopt fundamentalist practices and co opt fundamentalist support. In the 1980s and 1990s, the supposedly secular Turkish government maintained an Office of Religious Affairs with a budget larger than those of some ministries, financed the construction of mosques, required religious instruction in all public schools, and provided funding to Islamic schools, which quintupled in number during the 1980s, enrolling about 15% of secondary school children, and which preached Islamist doctrines and produced thousands of graduates, many of whom entered government service. In symbolic but dramatic contrast to France, the government in practice allowed schoolgirls to wear the traditional Muslim headscarf 70 years after Ataturk banned the fez. These government actions, in large part motivated by the desire to take the wind out of the sails of Islamists, testify to how strong that wind was in the 1980s and early 1990s. Second, the resurgence of Islam changed the character of Turkish politics. Political leaders, most notably Turgut Özal, quite explicitly identified themselves with Muslim symbols and policies. In Turkey, as elsewhere, democracy reinforced indigenization and the return to religion. In their eagerness to curry favor with the public and gain votes, politicians, and even the military, the very bastion and guardian of secularism, had to take into account the religious aspirations of the population. Not a few of the concessions that they granted smacked of demagoguery. Popular movements were religiously inclined, while elite and bureaucratic groups, particularly the military, were secularly oriented. Islamist sentiments manifested themselves within the armed forces, and several hundred cadets were purged from the military academies in 1987 because of suspected Islamist sentiments. The major political parties increasingly felt the need to seek electoral support from revived Muslim tariqas or select societies which Ataturk had banned. In the March 1994 local elections, the Fundamentalist Welfare Party, alone among the five major parties, increased its share of the vote, receiving roughly 19% of the votes as compared with the 21% of Prime Minister Siller's True Path Party and 20% for the late Özal's Motherland Party. The Welfare Party captured control of Turkey's two principal cities, Istanbul and Ankara, and ran extremely strong in the southeastern part of the country. In the December of 1995 elections, the Welfare Party won more votes and seats in parliament than any other party, and 6 months later took over the government in coalition with one of the secular parties. As in other countries, support for the fundamentalists came from the young, returned immigrants, the downtrodden and disposed, and new urban migrants, the sans culottes of the big cities. Third, the resurgence of Islam affected Turkish foreign policy. Under President Özal's leadership, Turkey decisively sided with the West in the Gulf War, anticipating that this action would further its membership in the European community. This consequence did not, however, materialize, and NATO hesitation over what response it would make if Turkey had been attacked by Iraq during the war did not reassure the Turks as to how NATO would respond to a non-Russian threat to their country. Turkish leaders tried to expand their military connection with Israel, which provoked intense criticism from Turkish Islamists. More significantly, during the 1980s, Turkey expanded its relations with Arab and other Muslim countries, and in the 1990s actively promoted Islamic interests by providing significant support to the Bosnian Muslims as well as to Azerbaijan. With respect to the Balkans, Central Asia, or the Middle East, Turkish foreign policy was becoming increasingly Islamicized. For many years, Turkey met two of the three minimum requirements for a torn country to shift its civilizational identity. Turkey's elites overwhelmingly supported the move, and its public was acquiescent. The elites of the recipient Western civilization, however, were not receptive. While the issue hung in the balance, the resurgence of Islam within Turkey activated anti Western sentiments among the public and began to undermine the secularist pro Western orientation of Turkish elites. The obstacles to Turkey's becoming fully European, the limits on its ability to play a dominant role with respect to the Turkic former Soviet republics, and the rise of Islamic tendencies eroding the Ataturk inheritance, all seem to ensure that Turkey will remain a torn country. Reflecting these conflicting pulls, Turkish leaders regularly described their country as a bridge between cultures. Turkey Prime Minister Tansu Çiller argued in 1993 is a both Western democracy and part of the Middle East and bridges two civilizations physically and philosophically. Reflecting this ambivalence in public in her own country, Siller often appeared as a Muslim, but when addressing NATO, she argued that the geographic and political fact is that Turkey is a European country. President Süleyman Demirel similarly called Turkey a very significant bridge in a region extending from west to east, that is, from Europe to China. A bridge, however, is an artificial creation connecting two solid entities but is a part of neither. When Turkey's leaders term their country a bridge, they euphemistically confirm that it is torn. Mexico. Turkey became a torn country in the 1920s, Mexico not until the 1980s. Yet their historical relations with the West have certain similarities. Like Turkey, Mexico had a distinctly non Western culture. Even in the 20th century, as Octavio Pez put it, the core of Mexico is Indian. It is not European. In the 19th century, Mexico, like the Ottoman Empire, was dismembered by Western hands. In the second and third decades of the 20th century, Mexico, like Turkey, went through a revolution which established a new basis of national identity and a new one party political system. In Turkey, however, the revolution involved both a rejection of traditional Islamic and Ottoman culture and an effort to import Western culture and to join the West. In Mexico, as in Russia, the revolution involved incorporation and adaptation of elements of Western culture, which generated a new nationalism opposed to the capitalism and democracy of the West. Thus, for 60 years, Turkey tried to define itself as European, while Mexico tried to define itself in opposition to the United States. From the 1930s to the 1980s, Mexico's leaders pursued economic and foreign policies that challenged American interests. In the 1980s, this changed. President Miguel de la Madrid began and his successor, President Carlos Salinas de Gortari, carried forward a full-scale redefinition of Mexican purposes, practices and identity, the most sweeping effort at change since the revolution of 1910. Salinas became, in effect, the Mustafa Kemal of Mexico. Ataturk promoted secularism and nationalism, dominant themes in the West of his time. Salinas promoted economic liberalism, one of the two dominant themes in the West of his time. The other, political democracy, he did not embrace. As with Ataturk, these views were broadly shared by political and economic elites, many of whom, like Salinas and de la Madrid, had been educated in the United States. Salinas dramatically reduced inflation, privatized large numbers of public enterprises, promoted foreign investments, reduced tariffs and subsidies, reconstructed the foreign debt, challenged the power of labor unions, increased productivity, and brought Mexico into the North American free trade agreement with the United States and Canada. Just as Ataturk's reforms were designed to transform Turkey from a Muslim Middle Eastern country into a secular European country, Salinas's reforms were designed to change Mexico from a Latin American country into a North American country. This was not an inevitable choice for Mexico. Conceivably, Mexican elites could have continued to pursue the anti US, third world nationalist and protectionist path that their predecessors had followed for most of the century. Alternatively, as some Mexicans urged, they could have attempted to develop with Spain, Portugal, and South American countries an Iberian Association of Nations. Will Mexico succeed in its North American quest? The overwhelming bulk of the political, economic, and intellectual elites favored that course. Also, unlike the situation with Turkey, the overwhelming bulk of the political, economic, and intellectual elites of the recipient civilization have favored Mexico's cultural realignment. The crucial intercivilizational issue of immigration highlights this difference. The fear of massive Turkish immigration generated resistance from both European elites and publics to bringing Turkey into Europe. In contrast, the fact of massive Mexican immigration, legal and illegal, into the United States was part of Salinas's argument for NAFTA. Either you accept our goods or you accept our people. In addition, the cultural distance between Mexico and the United States is far less than that between Turkey and Europe. Mexico's religion is Catholicism. Its language is Spanish. Its elites were oriented historically to Europe, where they sent their children to be educated, and more recently to the United States, where they now send their children. The accommodation between Anglo American, North American, and Spanish Indian Mexico should be considerably easier than that between Christian Europe and Muslim Turkey. Despite these commonalities, after ratification of NAFTA, opposition to any closer involvement with Mexico developed in the United States with demands for restrictions on immigration, complaints about factories moving south, and questions about the ability of Mexico to adhere to the North American concepts of liberty and the rule of law. The third prerequisite to the successful shift of identity by a torn country is general acquiescence, although not necessarily support by its public. The importance of this factor depends in some measure on how important the views of the public are in the decision-making process of the country. Mexico's pro-Western stance was, as of 1995, untested by democratization. The New Year's Day revolt of a few thousand well-organized and extremely supported guerrillas in Chiapas was not, in itself, an indication of substantial resistance to North Americanization. The sympathetic response it engendered, however, among Mexican intellectuals, journalists, and other shapers of public opinion suggested that North Americanization in general and NAFTA in particular could encounter increasing resistance from Mexican elites and the public. President Salinas very consciously gave economic reform and westernization priority over political reform and democratization. Both economic development and the increasing involvement with the United States, however, will strengthen forces promoting a real democratization of the Mexican political system. The key question for the future of Mexico is, to what extent will modernization and democratization stimulate de-westernization, producing its withdrawal from or the drastic weakening of NAFTA, and parallel changes in the policies imposed on Mexico by its Western oriented elites of the 1980s and 1990s. Is Mexico's North Americanization compatible with its democratization? Australia. In contrast to Russia, Turkey, and Mexico, Australia has from its origin been a Western society. Throughout the 20th century, it was closely allied with first Britain and then with the United States. And during the Cold War, it was not only a member of the West but also of the US, UK, Canadian, Australian military and intelligence corps of the West. In the early 1990s, however, Australia's political leaders decided in effect that Australia should defect from the West, redefine itself as an Asian society, and cultivate close ties with its geographical neighbors. Australia Prime Minister Paul Keating declared must cease being a branch office of empire, become a republic, and aim for enmeshment in Asia. This was necessary, he argued, in order to establish Australia's identity as an independent country. Australia cannot represent itself to the world as a multicultural society. Engage in Asia, make that link, and make it persuasively, while in some way, at least in constitutional terms, remaining a derivative society. Australia, Keating declared, had suffered untold years of Anglophilia and torpor, and continued association with Britain would be debilitating to our national culture, our economic future, and our destiny in Asia and the Pacific. Foreign Minister Gareth Evans expressed similar sentiments. The case for redefining Australia as an Asian country was grounded on the assumption that economics overrides culture in shaping the destiny of nations. The central impetus was the dynamic growth of the East Asian economies, which in turn spurred the rapid expansion of Australian trade with Asia. In 1971, East and Southeast Asia absorbed 39% of Australia's exports and provided 21% of Australia's imports. By 1994, East and Southeast Asia were taking 62% of Australia's exports and providing 41% of its imports. In contrast, in 1991, 11.8% of Australian exports went to the European Community and 10.1% to the United States. This deepening economic tie with Asia was reinforced in Australian minds by a belief that the world was moving in the direction of three major economic blocs and that Australia's place was in the East Asian bloc. Despite these economic connections, the Australian Asian ploy appears unlikely to meet any of the requirements for success for a civilization shift by a torn country. First, in the mid 1990s, Australian elites were far from overwhelmingly enthusiastic about this course. In some measure, this was a partisan issue with the leaders of the Liberal Party ambivalent or opposed. The Labour government also came under substantial criticism from a variety of intellectuals and journalists. No clear elite consensus existed for the Asian choice. Second, public opinion was ambivalent. From 1987 to 1993, the proportion of the Australian public favouring the end of the monarchy rose from 21% to 46%. At that point, however, support began to waver and to erode. The proportion of the public supporting deletion of the Union Jack from the Australian flag dropped from 42% in May of 1992 to 35% in August of 1993. As one Australian official observed in 1992, it's hard for the public to stomach it. When I say periodically that Australia should be part of Asia, I can't tell you how many hate letters I get. Third and most important, the elites of Asian countries have been even less receptive to Australia's advances than European elites have been to Turkey's. They have made it clear that if Australia wants to be part of Asia, it must become truly Asian, which they think unlikely, if not impossible. The success of Australia's integration with Asia, one Indonesian official said, depends on one thing: how far Asian states welcome the Australian intention. Australia's acceptance in Asia depends on how well the government and the people of Australia understand Asian culture and society. Asians see a gap between Australia's Asian rhetoric and its perversely Western reality. The Thais, according to the one Australian diplomat, treat Australia's insistence it is Asian with bemused tolerance. Culturally, Australia is still European, Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia declared in October 1994. We think it's European, and hence Australia should not be a member of the East Asian Economic Caucus. We Asians are less prone to making outright criticisms of other countries or passing judgment on them. But Australia, being European culturally, feels that it has the right to tell others what to do, what not to do, what is right and what is wrong. And then, of course, it is not compatible with the group. That is my reason for opposing their membership in EAEC. It is not the color of the skin, but the culture. Asians, in short, are determined to exclude Australia from their club for the same reason that Europeans do Turkey. They are different from us. Prime Minister Keating liked to say that he was going to change Australia from odd man out to the odd man in Asia. That, however, is an oxymoron. Odd men don't get in. As Mahathir stated, culture and values are the basic obstacle to Australia's joining Asia. Clashes regularly occur over Australians' commitment to democracy, human rights, a free press, and its protests over the violations of those rights by governments of virtually all its neighbours. The real problem for Australia in the region, a senior Australian diplomat noted, is not our flag but the root social values. I suspect you won't find any Australians who are willing to surrender any of those values to be accepted in the region. Differences in character, style, and behavior are also pronounced. As Mahathir suggested, Asians generally pursue their goals with others in ways which are subtle, indirect, modulated, devious, non judgmental, non moralistic, and non confrontational. Australians, in contrast, are the most direct, blunt, outspoken, some would say insensitive people in the English speaking world. The clash of cultures was most dramatically evident in Paul Keating's own dealings with Asians. Keating embodied Australian national characteristics to an extreme. He has been described as a pile driver of a politician with a style that is inherently provocative and pugnacious. He did not hesitate to denounce his political opponents as scumbags, perfumed gigolos, and brain damaged loony crimes. While arguing that Australia must be Asian, Keating regularly irritated, shocked, and antagonized Asian leaders by his brutal frankness. The gap between cultures was so large that it blinded the proponent of cultural convergence to the extent his own behavior repelled those whom he claimed as cultural brethren. The Keating Evans choice could be viewed as the short sighted result of overweighing economic factors and ignoring rather than renewing the country's culture, and as a tactical political ploy to distance distract attention from Australia's economic problems. Alternatively, it could be seen as a far-sighted initiative designed to join Australia to and to identify Australia with the rising centers of economic, political, and eventually military power in East Asia. In this respect, Australia could be the first of possibly many Western countries to attempt to defect from the West and bandwagon with rising non-Western civilizations. At the beginning of the 20th at the beginning of the 22nd century, historians might look back on the Keating Evans choice as a major marker in the decline of the West. If that choice is pursued, however, it will not eliminate Australia's Western heritage, and the lucky country will be a permanently torn country. Both the branch office of empire, which Paul Keating decried, and the new white trash of Asia, which Lee Kuan Yew contemptuously termed it. This was not and is not an unavoidable fate for Australia. Accepting their desire to break with Britain instead of defining Australia as an Asian power, Australia's leaders could define it as a Pacific country, as indeed Keating's predecessor as Prime Minister, Robert Hawke, attempted to do. If Australia wishes to make itself a republic, separated from British Crown, it could align itself with the first country in the world to do that, a country which, like Australia, is of British origin, is an immigrant country, is of continental size, speaks English, has been an ally in 3 wars, and has an overwhelmingly European, if also like Australia, increasingly Asian population. Culturally, the values of the July 4th, 1776 Declaration of Independence accord far more with Australian values. Accord far more with the Australian values than do those of any Asian country. Economically, instead of attempting to batter its way into a group of societies from which it is culturally alien and who, for that reason, reject it, Australia's leaders could propose expanding NAFTA into a North American South Pacific arrangement, including the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Such a grouping would reconcile culture and economics and provide a solid and enduring identity for Australia that will not come from futile efforts to make Australia Asian. The Western virus and cultural schizophrenia. While Australia's leaders embarked on a quest for Asia, those from other torn countries, Turkey, Mexico, Russia, attempted to incorporate the West into their societies and to incorporate their societies into the West. Their experience strongly demonstrates, however, the strength, resilience, and viscosity of indigenous cultures and their ability to renew themselves and to resist, contain, and adapt Western imports. While the rejectionist response to the West is impossible, the Kemalist response has been unsuccessful. If non Western societies are to modernize, they must do it in their own way, not the Western way, and emulating Japan, building up and employing their own traditions, institutions, and values. Political leaders imbued with the hubris to think that they can fundamentally reshape the culture of their societies are destined to fail. While they can introduce elements of Western culture, they are unable permanently to suppress or to eliminate the core elements of their indigenous culture. Conversely, the Western virus, once it is lodged in another society, is difficult to expunge. The virus persists but is not fatal. The patient survives but is never whole. Political leaders can make history, but they cannot escape history. They produce torn countries. They do not create Western societies. They infect their country with a cultural schizophrenia which becomes its continuing and defining characteristic.